Hi, I'm Liz Munoz, CEO of Torrid. Whether you're looking for sparkly or cozy, Torrid has it all for the holidays and beyond. From our bombshell jeans to our life-changing wire-free bras, all designed to fit your curves perfectly. So visit Torrid.com and feel the fit today.
Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Spiritual discovery in a time of upheaval. Boy, we certainly can use that during this crazy year of 2020 as we found a lot of us locked down due to COVID-19, finding a lot of protests which turned into large riots, and the uncertainty of an upcoming presidential election and how that will leave our country. But we'll discover that certain spiritual views can affect progress for communities just as they do for individuals. Joining us here on the program today, our guest says prayer is about spiritual discovery. It's also about understanding more of what God is and learning to see our lives and the world through the lens of God's all-good nature. It's also about stripping away surface-level appearances in order to discern what actually is. Spiritual discovery, after all, reveals what is substantial, lasting, and powerful, which leads to healing. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and Christian Science practitioner, Mr. Tom McElroy. Tom, thank you for being on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. It's great to be here with you.
Now, how do you find when it comes to upheaval, it's sort of like saying in adversity there's always a seed of truth and growth. How do you see that in this world today and how you can share that with our listeners?
Well, it's a good question. I've been thinking a lot about wilderness experiences in the Bible. Anyone who's a Bible reader would be maybe familiar with that kind of a concept. If you're not, that's fine. But I think the gist is what you see is that, it's a human thing that it doesn't matter what time we're in. When stuff gets uncomfortable and the usual support systems we're used to relying on and looking to for our comfort and our happiness gets stripped away and we feel kind of out in the cold. The benefit of that sometimes is that we go looking for stuff that's more substantial, that's more lasting, that is more reliable. And I would say that just given phone calls I've had from, friends from high school from 20 years ago saying to me, I'm in marketing, everything's been going great, until I realized it's not, and it hasn't been. And, and I didn't realize that until everything got turned upside down. And now I'm asking bigger questions. And I think, the big questions are always there. The need to find that more substantial, important stuff in life is always there. But sometimes it's not till the other stuff gets stripped away and uncomfortable that we really, go looking for it. And I feel like that's what's happening now, and that aspect of things is going to be good, I think, going forward.
Now, I know you mentioned prayer, and it's really fascinating how a lot of times people will tend to pray when things are rough. It's an uncertain territory they find themselves in and whether or not they'll get to the other side. But prayer can be a lot more significant than just kind of calling out when things don't feel so good, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of it has to do with how you define prayer. I mean, if you think of prayer as appealing to this kind of far-off deity to intervene for you sometimes when things go bad, like the great clockworker in the sky, that as long as things are ticking along, that's fine, but I call on that person to come help me out, then, then prayer stays in that realm of just appealing for intervention when necessary. But if you look at prayer maybe in a broader way as a way of tuning in all the time, and you could call prayer a lot of things, meditation and so forth, but the idea, I think, is the way Jesus described it is as taking a step back from, the appearances around you, trying to look good in front of others, or I would say even trying to, all our own fears and knee-jerk reactions to things as they appear to be. And then when Jesus is asked, how do you pray, he gives what many Christians today call the Lord's Prayer, which talks about the nature of God and our relationship with God and feeling and experiencing that. So if we look at that as our model, then prayer can be this way of, at any point, getting beyond the surface appearance of things, which can be knee-jerk reactions and fears to problems, but it can also be, kind of like my friend in marketing who called me, even a very satisfied sense that ultimately is limited and kind of hollow. to at any point be discovering something more substantial in and of our relationship with God. And that kind of then begs the question, what is God? Which we could talk about for hours, but just, if God is not this far off clockworker, if God is actually the source of all good and all life and is ever present, then that's something we would want to access all the time. I mean, that's actually where our deepest joys and our most progressive ideas are going to come from, the things that we need just for the little aspects of life, as well as the things that we need in our greater, progress in our communities. So prayer has this kind of regular place in life if you look at it, in this broader lens, I think.
Now, would it be kind of a stretch to think, because you had mentioned prayer and then meditation kind of seeming to be not necessarily the same, but to a degree it is, that prayer, for instance, when a lot of people think of prayer, you're down on your hands or you're down on your knees, you got your hands clasped together, and as I said, usually people will tend to pray when things aren't going so well, looking for answers or, alleviate me of my pain, if you will, is usually what the prayer is about. But it sounds to me that prayer can be something, especially the way Jesus had molded a universal way to pray, that is showing more of a direct nature of a relationship with God and who God is, especially when it comes to, things such as healing and spiritual discovery and what that looks like. So it seems to me it's more like, when you think of it from a meditative perspective, a way of just kind of clearing the mind and listening for answers deep within yourself and allowing that time and space for these things to surface. Would that be another way to look at prayer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the word meditate shows up in the Bible too, but often it's in a part of a greater phrase, like meditate on the Lord. And so all of these things, I mean, we all have many ways of thinking about them and many ways of expressing them. Amy, you talked about being down on your hands and knees. There are people that, for them, their tradition is to pray in a certain physical position, whether that's with your hands up or your hands down or your hands together or holding something. Many cultures approach this in different ways, but, Jesus didn't really get in too much to the outward form. It was more about what's going on in thought and in your heart. He talked about qualities like meekness and hungering and thirsting after righteousness and purity in heart. And so, I think it's fair game to say whatever you feel comfortable with outwardly is one thing, but what is that leading to? And so just a little bit of, humility and self-honesty helps us know, are we getting out of ourselves when we pray? I know a lot of folks that meditate, but who think of meditation more as just quieting the outward stuff. It's that first step of take a step back, from the surface appearance or fears or opinions, but then there's not anything that comes afterwards. So when you come out of that meditative state, everything still looks the same as it did before, and you don't have any new perspectives or information. And you even use the phrase kind of looking within yourself, and that can mean different things to folks, but if it means just look within the information you already have, that still can only go so far. If it means look within this deep relationship you have within yourself that's connected to something greater than self and individual selfhood, but to the kind of mind of the universe, the creator of all, again, right ideas of goodness, God, the kind of God that gave inspiration to people in the wilderness, when didn't look like there's any food to eat, but they found food, or in the middle of war and have found safety. Then you come out of a prayer state or meditative state with something new. The landscape looks different. You are informed and empowered with a new perspective that is rooted in something spiritual, something more than just the surface appearance of things. And to me, that's the kind of prayer that leads to progress.
Now, it's really fascinating, too, is that when you think about, like, this day and age, we seem to have a lot of people who are, I guess, triggered because of beliefs that are ingrained. They haven't really kind of opened themselves up, perhaps, to growth, so they're staying pretty hard and steady in their course, which can eventually, for some, and in some cases many, lead to violent outcomes for a truth they feel needs to be not only healed, but come to peace with. So, you take a look at all this, and so you have, whole communities who could be rooted in misperceptions based on surface level reasoning. And, rather than seeing things as they are in reality, they see them the way they choose to see them. And could you describe how perhaps prayer can help people begin to shift that, so perhaps they can come to a deeper level or even transcend their misperception to a level where they can come to a deeper understanding and then healing?
You've got great questions, Daniel. Yeah.
Well, it just kind of comes to me in this day and age, especially, and I know you're aware of this year, there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, if there's ever been a year that we can
yeah.
see clearly, 2020 is it, isn't it?
Yeah, and we need it. And it's not going to leave us where it found us, and hopefully that's in a good way. What I love about your question is just it's thinking about those folks that sometimes just get too easily cast away as the other, and that could be wherever you're standing, the person on the other side is the other. But to me, if we're talking about God from a standpoint of not just my God or my tribal leader or my clock worker, who favors me, or some others that pray like I do, but as really the maker of all that is real and lasting and good, and as able to supplant and uplift and heal that which is unlike God's nature, which is not actually natural for any of us, for life. Then our prayers have to embrace everybody. You can't have like a mathematical equation that you think applies to you and not to somebody else, or you don't really understand the math, right? So as prayer is leading us to bigger views of God, those views have to be inclusive. And so when we look out and we see people, whoever they may be to us, that seem to be so entrenched in their own views, I think we can start with compassion, because we've all probably been there at different times. And usually if we think about it, when we feel stuck like that, it's often out of fear, that we don't believe there's something else that's better, and that we think that's what's good is on the line, and maybe lost, maybe destroyed if we don't just dig our heels in and try and survive and try and maybe even destroy the other folks who are going to take away our good. That's not a comfortable mental state to be in. And so we can have compassion for anybody who has gotten to the point where that's all the only options they see in front of them. There is more, and they deserve to know that, and that doesn't mean they deserve to think like I think or believe what I believe, but it does mean that they deserve to see a bigger sense of good that is more invulnerable than that. A good that they can access and will always be present for them, that the qualities of life that are good are not actually in conflict because they come from the same source. We tend to argue sometimes, believing that we're either fighting for love and compassion, or we're fighting for principle and security and liberty. And that's like a false dichotomy. I mean, that's a distraction from what is actually true, which is that all good comes from the same source. And when we understand it right, those qualities can't be in conflict with one another. There is no actual tug of war. So when we're discovering more through our prayer about the nature of those qualities, we get to see that, and that frees us. That frees us from our fears, and that allows us to find those qualities, sometimes in new forms, than we knew them before, sometimes in a new way, but never in a way that's lesser, never like a plan B, but always in an infinite idea being able to take infinite new shapes and forms. And so our prayers then for everybody can start with compassion, loving those folks, and begin to see that, they don't deserve to be in that spot. And actually the same God that is the source of the kind of good we're talking about is the source of their inspiration, their capacity to think in a way that is freeing to them. That there is a kind of divine lawmaker here, and the laws we're talking about are not, favoring one or another, but the cause the inherent outcome of the facts of God's nature in our lives. Those laws dictate, in essence, that what's good must be expressed, that we must be free, that freedom has to take shape. We can't be imprisoned by fear forever. Something has to reach us. Something has to inspire us and break us free. Our prayers can embrace everyone in that way, which doesn't impose my opinion on them, but allows them to think more for themselves. Think more from the nature of this unifying, all-good God. Even if they don't call it God, it doesn't matter. Whatever is good and true can dawn in thought for anybody, because that's normal for everybody. And so our prayers sometimes have to do with kind of, in Jesus' language, casting the beam out of our own eye and seeing our brothers and sisters more as God knows them, more in the light of their inherent freedom and their inherent ability to think rightly and constructively, just as we would want somebody to pray that way about us when we're feeling a little trapped and afraid.
And it also goes hand in hand, too, when you think about this whole thing, Tom, is that we've all probably at one time or another in our lives heard, be the change that you wish to see. And it's a pretty unique experience to put that in motion, but it's not easy. Because you find yourself a lot of times in situations where you become, as I mentioned earlier, triggered by something. And then there's that belief surfacing up, the way that you want to see things. And then, as you say, violence can sometimes ensue. And I think violence a lot of times occurs when a person finds themselves in a situation or an environment where they believe they have no choices available to them. And so that's the only way they can find out of it. You can hear it in their language. They become angry, maybe even physical. And you're seeing a lot of this today, and it's funny because on the landscape, especially with all this protesting that's going on for one reason or another, is that everybody's citing away at that First Amendment, that entitled freedom we have of speech. What I see more often isn't so much that they're practicing their freedom of speech, in as much as you need to sit down and shut up and you need to hear me. See, that's not freedom of speech. That's a different entitlement altogether. I'm entitled to run my mouth, and you're entitled to sit there and listen to me while I do this. And there ain't nothing getting solved here. And if you could just simply shift your situation a little bit and say, well, why don't I just sit down and try to be the one who listens, rather than running my mouth, I think you might probably experience things a lot differently, and you might see the world differently. Could that be true?
Yeah, I think that's insightful, and I think that it does start with us, because the the conflict is when we see other people acting that way, then we tend to think that, well, we're just as justified to turn around and tell the people who are telling us to shut up, but then it's like the ultimate hypocrisy is calling the hypocrite,
the super paradox, in other words, yeah.
Right. So something has to break the chain, right? And so whatever side you're on, the path forward is the same. And the path forward is one we have great models for it, both in present times and in past times. But there's a point where we have to relinquish our justification, to be the one who's right. And it doesn't mean let go of what's right. That doesn't mean not stand for it. But it means, let go of the justification to be angry, with the recognition that what I really want is progress, then I need to be the first one to start listening. I need to be the first one to have compassion on the person who has gotten to the point of anger and violence because they're so afraid. Instead of just looking at the surface of the anger and the violence, I need to see the brokenheartedness that's beneath the surface, and I need to figure out how to meet that need. I need to figure out through my prayer how to bind up the brokenhearted and how to help them, take my neighbor, even someone I perceive to be my enemy, by the hand and help them see that whatever, whether it seems like a long history of inequality and injustice that seems entrenched and, systemic, where it seems like a good that is just whittling away that we had 50 to 100 years ago and is eroding faster than we know what to do with. Whatever the perception is, to help somebody begin to find the reality of the good, that is present, the equality, the safety, the lawfulness, the righteousness, the unity, and then not just talk about that, but practically take steps to help our communities and our whole communities experience that. What does that look like? How do I proactively help my neighbor experience that and stand for that? That's what will overturn the hate and the fear, which leads to, the upheaval and even violence in its extremes. Just fighting back never does it. And there are just so many examples of this in history of people who, sometimes even start on the violent end, but wisdom leads them to a higher ground, which just proves that, you look at where they started and the ineffectiveness of it ultimately, and where they end up and the way they transform communities, sometimes whole nations and so on, because they're working out from a higher principle that has power behind it. It's not just an abstract philosophy. There is a way that humanity progresses, and this is it. This is the only way that it happens. But we can do that from either side of the equation, right? And sometimes it has to begin with us, as you pointed out.
Now, what I found fascinating is I've been able to have guests through the Portland Christian Science Lecture Series come through the program here, is you all seem to have one definite thing in common other than the fact that you're involved with the Portland Christian Science Lecture Series, and that is that all of you, from what I've seen, have really been around the world. I mean, you've been to different countries, and so you've had many different perspectives, which is unique. Sometimes you might see somebody born in a small town here in the United States, and that's all they know. But when you've been to a place like, for instance, in your case, France or Belize, Vietnam, China, even Tibet, you have these perspectives about the way they see things. And a lot of times, if you stay, for lack of a better word at this point, isolated in one area for most of your life, that's the way you see things. So it's easy to be influenced about what other countries think about you. And that really narrows the perception down. And this here is truly about trying to widen that perception and realize inherently as human beings, we all really want the same things. We want to be loved, we want to be appreciated, and perhaps even respected. I mean, all of us really want that in our lives. Now, as you go and you speak to people, how do you share a way they can begin to see things that way? Because as I was just talking about, you might get triggered by somebody. Maybe it's somebody you just met, but something about them just bugs you. But there's a way that perhaps you can transcend that and look for the good in them, so the interaction becomes that and actually becomes nurturing, and you have a great learning experience at the same time.
I would say maybe because you said two things. You kind of talked about this group of speakers that you've interacted with, and I think I might touch on something you said there, which is, I think, interesting and maybe plays in a foundational way to the next part. One thing that all these speakers have in common is that we are all folks that are practicing, Christian Science, who are trying to understand this approach to understanding Jesus' teachings in the Bible, living them, and we're pretty unique folks. We all come from different areas of the world, as well as have traveled to different areas of the world, because we happen to be part of this board of speakers that travels and participates in these kinds of series of talks. But every single one of us, regardless of where we came from or how old we are or anything else, has learned about what we're talking about from the book Science and Health is Key to the Scriptures, which was written by Mary Baker Eddy. She's the founder of the Christian Science movement, and it's that book that is the one that is taking Scripture and saying, look, here's a way to apply that. Here's a way to really live that. Here's a way that can feel less abstract to you, and that you can actually follow in the footsteps of what Jesus asked us to do. And this woman who wrote the book and is the founder of the movement, Mary Baker Eddy, she hardly left New England. So she traveled to Chicago once or twice and down, just like the Carolinas a little bit. But that's about the extent of it. I mean, we're talking about the 1800s when she lived. She was born in rural New England and lived most of her life there. So it's not necessarily, being able to jet set around the world, what gives one spiritual perspective. I think, again, if that were necessary, that would have been listed somewhere in Jesus' Beatitudes, must travel. But what he describes, again, are more states of heart, meekness and hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Those are the things that I mentioned before. And there's others there. But to me, anybody can have that. I mean, I feel like anybody, for example, could take the Bible, could take science and health together with the Bible, even if they've never left their little town, and get massive perspectives about a universal principle, that is a sense of God, in how it applies to all things in a way that informs them. Then when they flip on the news, whatever news channel they watch, or talk to their neighbor, wherever their neighbors are coming from, it begins to inform, that perspective. And to the degree that it does, it allows any of us to experience what Jesus talked about and to prove it more, step by step by step, just modestly even. But even modestly, that's pretty great for the world. And so, I feel like it's not necessarily contingent on a particular role or where you've been or where you're coming from. To me, the beauty of this, the most wonderful aspect is that it is for everybody. A science is for everybody. There's something equalizing and inherently non-hierarchical in that. It means anybody, wherever they are, is empowered, not because of their circumstances, but because of the principle behind what they're learning. And that prayer, as we've talked about, can embrace our neighbors anywhere and bring healing. So then translating that into the second part of your question about what do you do when you're faced with somebody and it seems tough. I'll tell you a quick story. I worked for a number of years as a prison chaplain in Los Angeles County, and I met with plenty of guys who on the surface had been through lots of things and had a record having done crazy things. And granted, a lot of the guys who came out to talk to me were seeking, so that's sometimes different than the folks you feel faced with who you don't feel like are seeking anything more than what they know. But I'll tell you one story. A guy came out and he was pretty in his own world. Sometimes the guys came out of their cell just to get out of the cell. And this one guy came up to me and he just said, I love it if you'd sign some forms for me, vouch for me. I need help. I need to transfer. I don't want to be in this cell anymore. There's guys there that are going to hurt me if I go back. And he was pretty actually worked up. And he was kind of shaking and upset. And I was about to start a church service. So I had all these guys coming out. And as you can imagine, you can't, for a security standpoint, stand there and talk to one guy when you have all these other guys milling around doing what they want. So I had to tell him, look, sit down and pay attention. You're going to get something out of this service that we're going to do. And, he probably thought I just didn't care about him, which wasn't the case. But a lot of those guys have felt treated like trash in their lives. And so, how did he know I was any different or thinking any different about him? And we got started. We started with a hymn, and actually the words in the hymn, I thought, oh man, this is perfect for this guy. So I turned and I looked over, and you know what? This guy, he wasn't even paying attention. He was sitting sideways in his chair. At this point, he was just kind of rocking back and forth. He was like in a pretty bad state, kind of on the verge of tears. And unfortunately, I have to just admit, like my first thought was, this guy, how does he expect to get anything out of this? He says he wants help, but he's not even paying attention. And, that made me feel trapped. That made me feel kind of condemning of him. And then I'm happy to say I had a little bit better thought a few moments later. This thought came to me, you know what, like even if he's not paying attention, The good news is that beneath the surface of this, what is happening is there's this guy that God made. And in the words of the Bible, he's made in the likeness of God. That means he has built into him already the inherent capacity to hear God, to be in tune with God, to be receptive to God, to perspectives that are progressive and healing. And that is already true. I don't have to make that true. My prayers don't make it true. My prayers help me acknowledge it and wake up to it and tune into it. And so right there, I was the one being inspired, right? I was being woken up to who this guy already was, which was different than what my original reaction was about it. And I found a peace in that moment. And I went on. I kept doing the service. We read from the Bible. We read from this book, Science and Health, as we were talking about applying the ideas. And then again, partway through the service, I thought of this guy again, and because there was this line, and I thought, oh, this will be perfect for him. And I looked back at the guy, and guess what I saw? He looked exactly the same, and nothing had changed. And my first thought was what it had been before. My first thought was, oh, that guy is not paying attention. It was like this kind of pattern, we get used to it. We get used to flipping on the news or thinking about the people we hear about, and just there can be plenty of evidence on the surface. Yeah, just look, nothing has changed. There they are again. Well, I had that too. I had the same evidence coming back at me again. But then I had this kind of like inspiration come and, metaphorically speaking, tap me on the shoulder again and be like, I'm sorry, what are you thinking? And it was like, again, a wake-up call. And I just, we get that as many times as we need in order to plunge in and like sort of open the window shades to let the light in. We're not responsible for how the light affects somebody else, but we can do something to help lift the shades, because the light then illumines our perspective, but also anyone else in the radius of that light. And that to me is why our prayers make a difference for others. We're letting in the light. We're not the power. We're not manipulating anyone else, changing anyone else. The light itself is revealing who and what they already are, what God has already made them to be. And the light has power. The light of God actually does something. It actually destroys darkness. It destroys ignorance. It destroys fear and all the things that grow out of that, including pain and just all the stuff we see and are dealing with. Well, this thought came back and kind of reminded me, like, who is this guy? What's going on there? Oh, right. He is already in tune and hearing God. God's talking to him, and he's responding. I had no evidence of that on the surface, but it felt true in a really deep way, more than a blind faith way. Like, this is like, oh, right. And I felt at peace again. And so, we wrapped up the service another 15, 20 minutes later, and oftentimes the guys would come up and talk to me afterward. One of the guys who came up was just expressing gratitude, shaking my hand. He's saying, thank you so much for coming. God bless you. And just as he was about to turn and go back to his cell, I recognized this is that guy. That's the same guy. I actually hadn't recognized him at first because he honestly looked different. I mean, he was standing up straight and tall. He was confident. He was clear-headed. He was, at peace. Something had changed. He didn't even want to talk to me. He didn't need me. Like, it wasn't about me. It was about him seeing what was true, right? We don't create truth. Truth is truth. And somehow, I don't know what he saw or felt, but there was just enough of a drastic change that he literally looked different. And I checked in on that guy a little later, and he moved on. I mean, he was doing fine after that. He I won't get into the details, but he progressed. And I didn't have a lot of interaction. I just checked in one time after that, and it seemed very good. But to me, it was a lesson. It was a kind of a wake up call. This is not about one-off events. This is not about miracles. This is about a principle of life that we can apply under many different circumstances. I can learn from that in a way that helps me see anybody in a new light, including when somebody seems very, in my face, either figuratively or literally.
Tom, too, as you brought up something that I think is really important, is that a lot of times, let's say, somebody finds a path that gets them very excited, or there's a particular message that they feel others should know about. They're inspired, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of times we go with that intention. It sounds like your story was in a way the same way as, I have this, why aren't you getting it? Kind of a thing. And so we have this intention that although we at first believe is, it's pure, that it's really, of a commitment, of compassion, but we have an expectation of an outcome. And a good for listeners out there to understand this a little bit deeper is when you go to help someone and you think that you're being altruistic when in fact you get disappointed when the outcome is you don't get appreciated for that. Or perhaps you have, an idea or perspective to share, and so somebody sounds like they're excited about having you share that with them, and so you get all this information, whatever the case is, give it to them, and then you're waiting for them to give you a response. So there's these expectations that could actually end up kind of blowing the high of the whole thing. And you have to realize perhaps maybe they've asked for these things. Your job is just to say, here, I've got a resource. Why don't you go ahead and check it out in your own time? And this seemed to be the case here with this gentleman that you found within the prison system here, that you had this message, and boy, if he could just hear it, things would be different. But it's in his time that he would absorb and have that experience. And that's that space where you need to allow that to occur, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I got the benefit in that circumstance of seeing what I thought was a pretty tangible result. There are so many times that you don't. And so just like you're saying, I mean, that's very satisfying, right? If you see somebody kind of take off, you see the light bulb go on. If you're a school teacher or a parent or whatever, you know that. You thrive on that when you see that happen. And then the rest of the time, you have to trust that what's working is working. And that's where having a sense of there being a science behind this. I mean, calling it Christian Science is to say that there's a way to understand things that is not just blind faith, that is comprehensible, repeatable, but not always visible. And we get that in lots of areas of life already, right? I mean, if you're baking and you put the yeast into the dough or whatever, like you can't see it. You might keep opening up the oven and looking in there, but if you know the properties of yeast and how they work, you know it's going to have an effect, right? And the thing is, like, if we take that to an even more kind of metaphysical level, if we talk about it from the standpoint of math, 3 and 3 equals 6. We know that, just as we know that 3 trillion and 3 trillion equals 6 trillion. Well, how many of us are ever going to see or be able to identify 6 trillion of anything, right?
Right.
Empirically, right? Just looking at it. We're never going to know. And so at some point, the physical senses kind of fail us. And yet in that example, we also still know with scientific certainty that 3 and 3 trillion equals 6 trillion. Why do we know that? Because there's a principle behind it, and we can actually prove the principle on the micro scale of 3 and 3 equals 6. So when we're praying about ourselves or someone who doesn't seem to get it, or where we don't see a result, or we're praying about a whole nation of people, the likelihood that we're going to be able to connect the dots between our prayers and some change, or what seems to be no change, that's like on that scale, it doesn't happen. But does that mean we're just sort of casting our thoughts and prayers out to the wind and hoping something happens, or just using them to only comfort ourselves and stick our head in the sand and try and wait it out? I mean, I think it's better than that. I think.
Tom, are you still there? Well, it seems to me as though we might have been cut off, as though the power of God has stepped in and told Tom, I believe he needs to be somewhere else. So when we take a look at Christian Science, for those of you tuning in, if you happen to be in the Portland, Oregon area, you can go to pdxcslectureseries.com. That's pdxcslectureseries.com, and you can discover a lot more about their particular schedule in case you want to participate in some of their talks. But there's also a fantastic website, as you'll see a lot of webinar links and videos as well on a lot of great topics in there. And I'll tell you, it's really a wonderful, eye-opening experience for those of you who are interested in exploring Christian Science and the things they have to offer. And it is something, whether you have a faith you already practice, or maybe you just don't, this can still have benefit for everybody who is out there should they decide they want to pursue this. Again, joining us here on the program today was our special guest, Tom, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program to talk about this and the power of prayer. I'd like to thank all of you listeners out there for joining us. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, wherever you are is where you should be. Have a great day.